A new bill introduced in the House. It looks to sanction thousands of China's top officials, including Xi Jinping and his family. A quarantined journalist longs for a cup of coffee after more than a week in Olympic isolation. We look at what athletes say about the scene in Beijing. The Olympics seeks to build a more peaceful world, but China may be using the Games for another purpose. We hear from a Chinese-American architect about what the Beijing Games have cost his family. A map shows just how close visitors to China are to the country's human rights abuses. It reveals Beijing detention centers are just minutes away from Olympic stadiums. And a dissident and former torchbearer for the 2008 Summer Olympics speaks out. That's after China selected a Uyghur athlete to carry the 2022 Olympic flame. Welcome to China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. Before we dive into today's news, make sure to use the link below to subscribe to our newsletter. This week, we'll round up the highlights and controversies surrounding Beijing's Winter Olympics and an exclusive behind-the-scenes snapshot for readers. Keep an eye out. The newsletter will land in your inbox Friday morning. A new bill is on the House floor. It was introduced Wednesday and moves to sanction officials from China's highest governmental body. That's including CCP head Xi Jinping and his family. The bill is titled the Sanctioning Tyrannical and Oppressive People Within the Chinese Communist Party Act, or the Stop CCP Act. It takes aim at the regime's National Congress, its more than 2,000 members, and their families. If passed, those sanctions will be blocked from getting U.S. visas and will lose access to the U.S. financial system, including any assets they may have in the country. What's more, had the bill been introduced in years past, Xi Jinping's daughter would not have been able to attend Harvard University, where she graduated in 2014. The next meeting of the National Congress is set for fall of this year. It will decide if Xi Jinping will remain in power for a third term. Top House conservatives are backing the bill, though it still needs to go through the House, the Senate, and arrive at the president's desk for signing into law. The Biden administration is raising the red flag on more than 30 Chinese entities. Officials say they can't verify whether the companies are legit and will impose more restrictions on their ability to source American products. The Commerce Department said Monday it added 33 Chinese entities to a roster of unverified businesses. The department explains that some products shipped to China, though seemingly for commercial use, end up being used for military purposes. The list includes both companies and universities. A number of them are tied to aerospace and electronics. And the only way to get delisted, China must permit U.S. officials to fully inspect them. U.S.-based companies will now need a special license in order to ship products to them. At the Beijing Winter Olympics, the key to freedom is a number, 35. That's the key measure of a COVID-19 virus test. A reading below 35 triggers a positive result and required quarantine in an isolation facility. An Associated Press journalist found himself on both sides of that red line this week, having taken tests that came back both positive and negative. Twice, he was instructed to stay in a holding facility outside the main Olympic Press Center. That's where he waited in isolation for his follow-up test results. A negative result triggers a return to the relative freedom of the Olympics closed loop. That bubble separates those in Beijing for the Games from the city's general population and comes complete with high walls, police patrols, and thickets of security cameras. But a positive test result can mean a swift transfer to an isolation hotel. Swedish journalist Philip Gadd just emerged from his stay in one. After 8 days in isolation, he finally got the call that released him.
So he called me and just told me that you're free. And I don't know, I thought that I would be happier, but I was just empty, empty and a bit stressed because I wanted to get out and start work.
An ambulance drove him back to his hotel room. From there, he wasted no time, hightailing it to the National Cross Country Center outside Beijing. arriving just in time to see Sweden's Jonas Sundling win gold in the women's sprint. The 28-year-old is a well-known reporter and web TV host, but he became a household name after failing a virus test and getting whisked away in an ambulance, dressed head to toe in personal protective equipment. He was the vehicle's only passenger for the trip to the isolation hotel.
You were in a foreign country, far away, and it was hard to communicate with the people in the hotel. And that was quite frightening, of course. I've started thinking more about how free I am in my normal life, that I can go whatever I want, I can do whatever I want. That kind of, that was something that I thought about quite a lot.
Spotted in a lobby bar holding a cup of instant coffee, Gad explained with a smile he'd been longing for this for more than a week. A gold medalist from Germany says she's waiting to comment on China until after she leaves the country. The Olympian Natalie Geisenberger was sharply critical of China prior to the Beijing Olympics, but said Wednesday that she would wait to speak on the subject.
Yes,
I think you have to be a bit careful about when saying what, where, and I think many are feeling this way.
She hinted there might be a few more things to be said upon her return to Germany. She leaves China later this week. According to Olympic rules, athletes can raise political or social issues under certain circumstances, provided there is no disruption or disrespect toward fellow competitors. But so far, athletes have stayed silent during the Winter Games. Geisenberger is the most decorated athlete in women's luge and widely seen as one of the sport's greatest of all time. The 9-time world champion and 6-time Olympic champion set a new track record in Tuesday's singles division. Her win extends Germany's domination of the event to a whopping 24 years. The International Olympic Committee says the goal of the Olympic movement is to build a peaceful and better world. But in China, hosting the event is reportedly used to justify something else. We hear from a Chinese-American architect about what the Games in Beijing have cost him and his family, both this year and in 2008. Here's more.
The year was 2008.
Amid much anticipation and curiosity, the Beijing Games opening ceremony gets underway. It promises, of course, to be a spectacular event.
Simon Zhang was in Xi'an, China, watching the Beijing Olympics opening ceremony on TV.
It's fantastic. The opening looks fabulous. Almost every major country's leaders went there. It's like a huge banquet celebrating unity. But to me, when I was watching that fabulous ceremony, I was thinking of my mom, what she was doing, and what was she suffering.
On that day, his mother, Ji Yuanzhi, was enduring one of her 150 days in a Chinese labor camp. She is a practitioner of Falun Gong, a spiritual discipline wildly popular in China before 1999. That's when Beijing launched a persecution campaign against it, aiming to eliminate it from the country. Ji was beaten, slapped, force-fed, and made to do forced labor, stripping ears of corn so prison guards can sell them to nearby farms.
She almost died there.
The Olympics, an event supposed to celebrate peace and human rights, was used by the Chinese regime to launch arrests and persecute dissidents, plus religious and ethnic minorities, all in the names of maintaining so-called social stability when foreigners flooded in for the Games. Amnesty International found that more than 100 Falun Gong practitioners died during 2008 from torture and other abuse while in detention or shortly after release. But those reports didn't stop China from hosting this year's Winter Games.
In Beijing tonight, the Winter Olympics kicking off. Fireworks during the opening ceremonies. They were something. Athletes from 87 countries taking part.
3 days before the Beijing Winter Olympics kicked off, Zhang's mother was arrested again, grabbed from her home by Chinese police in front of her husband. That day was also the start of the Lunar New Year holiday, an occasion for celebration and family reunion.
Is going through a hunger strike right now. And she's 65. She's health is not really good because of the persecution that happened to her in the past 20 years. We are really worried.
This is the third time Ji has been taken away by police. The first was in 2001.
I remember the day that we went to the local transportation center to bring her back home. She became so light. So she was like 160 pounds before she was arrested. When I was 16 years old, I put her on my back to move her into the house. She was really light. That's what I remember clearly. And the way she talks to me, she was really weak.
Yet the suffering hasn't changed Xi's heart.
She's naturally warm-hearted. She's really nice. She is a core of all the relatives of my family. So she organizes the family events. But on the other hand, we sometimes say she's stubborn, because once she thinks something is right, she will not give up.
Zhang moved to New York in 2013 and now works as an architect. He had tried but failed repeatedly to move his mom out of China. That's because Chinese authorities refused to issue her a passport. He shares a message for those outside China.
Don't be fooled by the propaganda of the Chinese regime. People are living happily there. Everyone is respected. That is totally a lie. And my mom, my family, is a good example of the opposite thing.
Penny Zhou, NTD News.
As the U.S. celebrates its gold medal in figure skating, human rights abuses may be happening just up the street. A Chinese detention center is just a short drive away from where U.S. figure skater Nathan Chen won gold.
The Falun Dafa Information Center recently released a map showing locations of Beijing's detention centers.
We went through the whole Beijing area. We mapped out the main Olympic venues. We mapped out the prison and detention centers so that people could see with their own eyes just how close these two things were in modern China.
One of those facilities in Beijing is the Chaoyang Detention Center. It's around a 10-minute drive from the figure skating venue, Capital Indoor Stadium. Horrific means of torture have happened inside the center. That's according to first-hand statements given to U.S.-based Falun Gong information website Minghui.org. Falun Gong practitioner Ms. Xiao Fengwen was previously detained there. When she went on a hunger strike, police would force-feed her, not to rescue her, but as a torture method. Police would force her mouth open using pliers. Her teeth became loose afterward. On one occasion, police inserted a tube through her nose and into her stomach to force-feed her. She says they pulled the tube back and forth to cause more pain. Another practitioner told Minghui.org about her experience. She recounted, "They started to force-feed me with the highly concentrated salt water. The tube was not removed after the force feeding was over, so I felt the extreme pain every time I breathed, and my eyes were full of tears. The suffering was beyond description." Other accounts of torture describe police pouring cold water onto detainees in freezing temperatures. They would then let the water slowly turn into ice on their bodies.
This regime is doing horrific things to prisoners of conscience right in the middle of one of their main cities, right in the middle of the Olympics. And
during the Olympics, Beijing heightened security around the venues and brings in more security personnel. Brody says Beijing has been simultaneously leveraging that extra security to crack down on dissidents. He adds that this has been the case since the 2008 Games. That's how popular Chinese singer and Falun Gong practitioner Yu Zhou and his wife Xina were arrested during that year's Summer Olympics.
They were at a Olympic-related security checkpoint, and the police officer simply found a Falun Gong book in their bag. That was it, and that was enough to take them both into custody. 11 days later,
Xina's husband died days later in prison. She was released 3 years later. But leading up to this year's Winter Olympics, a Beijing court sentenced Xi another 8 years in prison.
The CCP is so brazen and so audacious with suppressing, putting prisoners of conscience into prison. They'll do it wide open. They'll do it leading up to the Olympics, knowing it's going to get the full attention, almost as if they're sort of displaying that this is how they're going to treat Falun Gong and no one can do anything about it.
So then why do we hear little mention of Falun Gong from politicians and the media? Brody says a conflict of interest may be at play.
The CCP exerts a tremendous amount of political and economic pressure. And I think there are those who just feel that it's too much of a sacrifice of their own position, their own economic welfare, or the welfare of their area.
Brody says that the few who are not influenced by the CCP have been clear about this clampdown for years. that what's happening to Falun Gong in China is genocide.
Xi was far from the only one arrested leading up to the Olympics. In January 2022, at least 132 Falun Gong practitioners have been convicted by the regime due to their beliefs. This is according to statistics from Falun Gong information website minghui.org. Close to 24 of those convicted are 60 to 90 years old. Most were given 3 to 4 year sentences. 14 years apart, 2 Uyghurs from Xinjiang carried the Olympic flame in Beijing. One is now in the U.S., while his father is locked away in a Chinese jail. We sat down with him to hear his take on this year's Games.
A smiling Uyghur athlete featured in the spotlight at Beijing's opening ceremony for the Winter Olympics Friday. But was it a feel-good message about China's ethnic unity? Or in the eyes of the suppressed, a political move to whitewash what's happening in China's Xinjiang region, where the ruling Communist Party is accused of committing widespread human rights abuses?
That is very offensive to Uyghurs, especially at this moment, because millions of Uyghurs are languishing in the camps, in the jails.
Kamal Turk Yaukum, a former Uyghur torchbearer, now a dissident, calls Beijing's selection of his peer for this year's Olympics an elevated form of puppetry and says China has no position to host the Winter Games. This after reports say Beijing worsened its repression against the Uyghur minority and caused huge suffering to his family.
One of the casualties of this play was my father. He was a chief editor and one of the compilers of those literature textbooks for Uyghur kids. So he was arrested in 2016 October and was later sentenced to 15 years in prison.
Back in 2008, Yaukum was a star student, chosen to help carry the Olympic flame when Beijing hosted the Summer Games. At that time, he calls state pressure on Uyghurs to assimilate as repulsive, but relatively tolerable. So, being chosen to represent not only China, but also the Uyghurs at an international event, Yaukum said he was immensely honored to carry the torch. Despite disappointment, organizers wouldn't let him run wearing a Uyghur hat. But Uyghur people are proud of their ethnic identity, language, and culture, so the Chinese Communist Party's attempts at assimilation were not successful. So it changed its tactics.
They want to either fully eliminate or fully assimilate Uyghurs.
Now Yaukum says China has a much bigger goal. Using Beijing's global infrastructure project, the Belt and Road Initiative, China desires quick and total control over the Xinjiang region because of its geographical importance to the project.
The Chinese dream become a nightmare for Uyghurs and Tibets and other ethnic minorities nowadays.
So Beijing ramped up its oppression, starting with abolishing Uyghur language education. In its propaganda, Beijing portrays writers and editors of Uyghur language textbooks as turning Uyghur children into so-called terrorists.
So these people had to be punished. They had to be severely punished. The books has to be confiscated and burned, and the entire Uyghur language education has to be abolished.
As a result, Yaukum's father was arrested, along with his colleagues. They were charged on allegations that their work editing textbooks were subversive, even though the books had been used for years in schools. By then, Yaukum and the rest of his family had traveled to the U.S. to study abroad. They haven't returned to China, nor heard from Yaukum's father ever since. Today, Western researchers, journalists, and governments have documented widespread evidence of the suppression. It shows that more than 1 million Uyghurs and other Muslim minorities in Xinjiang have been detained in internment and forced labor camps. The allegations are a top reason the U.S. and its allies chose not to send diplomatic officials to the Winter Games. Beijing denies all of the accusations. What's more, China's decision to thrust a young Uyghur athlete into the spotlight only stirred up more controversy. White House spokesperson Jen Psaki told reporters,
"We can't allow this to be a distraction."
From the human rights abuses, the genocide that we're seeing in parts of China.
China rolled out its central bank digital currency for visitors and athletes to use at the Winter Olympics. It's a chance for Beijing to display the digital yuan to the world. But how much traction will it get? We talked to a business and economics expert to learn more. NTD's Don Ma has the story.
China's central bank digital currency is also known as digital yuan or renminbi. It's basically cash, but in a digital format. It's issued by China's central bank, and the bank can monitor every transaction made with it.
This could become better way, extremely good way for Chinese government to control people's personal finance.
At the Olympics, how exactly does Beijing plan to promote it? Athletes could be given a gift card containing the digital currency, and they will be free to spend it as they wish. But those athletes may run into a problem.
Where can they spend money? I think that's the weirdest thing. You can see they're given some little, you can say it's a play money, but they don't even have a place to play and use that money.
There's few places to spend the money because Chinese authorities have confined all athletes within a closed-loop system, or bubble. This is where the games will take place. It's not too different from a quarantine facility. Athletes aren't allowed to leave the area, and people outside aren't allowed to enter.
They'll find out this is probably most restricted, even more restricted than Hitler's Olympic game, the most restricted Olympic game in Olympic history.
This means that athletes aren't able to roam around Beijing to shop with the digital yuan. Professor Xi says it's possible China's merely using the Olympics as a publicity stunt. But he says promotion of the digital renminbi to other countries would be in vain.
Renminbi is not freely exchangeable. It's not freely convertible to other currencies. The digital Chinese currency is useless outside of China. So there's really no need for internationalization of Chinese digital currency. It's just a pointless promotion here.
One of the biggest topics of discussion surrounding China's digital yuan is whether it can eventually replace the US dollar to become the global reserve currency. But Professor Xie says he doesn't see that happening in the foreseeable future. Don Ma, NTD News.
The digitalization of physical money in China forges ahead. Two Chinese banks announced in January they are going cashless. Starting in April, the Beijing Zhongguanchun Bank will stop offering cash deposits, withdrawals, payments, and other cash-related services. This means customers will not be able to deposit or withdraw cash from the bank's ATM machines or from a bank clerk. The only way to use money from the bank would be through electronic means. To get the physical cash, you'd have to transfer the money to another bank. Liaoning Province's New Up Bank made a similar announcement. It will be ending its cash-related services next month. The announcements say this is a result of the bank's acceleration towards digital transformation. Tensions between China and Lithuania reach a new high this week. Reports say Beijing suspended Lithuanian beef imports. That's according to China's General Administration of Customs on Thursday. China failed to give a specific reason for the suspension, though the move's timing may hint at its motives. Britain announced on Monday it will join the U.S. and Australia in backing the EU-China trade dispute at the World Trade Organization. The case is over Beijing's trade curbs on Lithuania. The European Commission says Lithuanian exports to China fell over 90% in December, compared to the same month in 2020. Lithuania exported a quarter of its total beef exports to China last year. China's foreign ministry refused to elaborate on the beef suspension, but said Lithuania should correct its mistakes. On Thursday, ministry spokesman Zhao Lijian also urged Lithuania to reflect on its human rights record. That's following the Lithuanian foreign minister's call for the international community to work together in dealing with alleged human rights violations in China. Other nations have also responded to China's action. Taiwan condemned the beef suspension as unilateral and labeled it bullying. The island says it stands firmly with Lithuania. Now, for a quick update on China's pandemic situation. The Omicron variant is making its way through parts of southern China. One city in the Guangxi Autonomous Region has become a hotspot for the infection in recent days. It's called Baixie City and is home to nearly 4.5 million people. According to official data, almost 130 infection cases have been found in the city as of Tuesday. Due to the Chinese Communist Party's history of underreporting pandemic data, NTD cannot independently verify that number, and the real figure may actually be much higher. As of Monday, all residents there are under at-home quarantine orders. All schools and institutions are closed. Only supermarkets, farmers markets, hospitals, and drugstores remain open. City officials have also started mass virus testing locals. At the same time, no one is allowed to enter or leave the city. NTD spoke to a local hotel employee who explained the hotel she works at is fully occupied. She added that for now, it only houses those who need to be isolated. She declined to say how many.
I cannot tell you how many people are quarantined here.
Another worker for the city's airport told us all flights in and out of the area are canceled as of Tuesday. And that's all for today's China in Focus. Thanks for watching and see you tomorrow.